Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this flash briefing on the cybersecurity implications of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. I'm Alan Calder. I'm your host for this afternoon, and I'm the Chief Executive of IT Governance. We've been in the business of cybersecurity now for something like 20 years. We've 200 people around the world, and our focus is IT governance, risk and compliance, primarily built around cybersecurity and the challenges of enabling organizations of all sizes to deal with today's cybersecurity challenges. I've written a number of books on cybersecurity, none of which I'll be talking about today, but if you want to follow up on any of them, you can get them through the IT governance website. The briefing today is going to look at the news about Russian cyber attacks on Ukraine, and I guess and the Russian-Ukraine conflict, how that's likely to impact organizations' procurement and supply arrangements, cyber attacks on Ukraine, how those could impact organizations around the world, and practical steps that organizations could and should take to build defense in depth, which would enable them to deal with what's going on at the moment. It's, as we look at Russian cyber attacks already in the news, probably quite apposite that just as I was coming on to this webinar, there was news that the Ukrainian embassy in London, its website is offline and emails not working as a result of cyber attacks. Very direct impact, but you see in the slide a number of the questions and repercussions of the Russian attack on Ukraine and how that plays out around the world in terms of cyber attacks. Cyber attacks have long been a fundamental part of the Russian approach to warfare. Kinetic attacks on nation states have typically been accompanied by or preceded by cyber attacks on those organizations. And if we think about the impact on the world of what looks as though it's the biggest land war in Europe since the Second World War, and the extent to which Ukraine is fighting back and seeing off what we were led to believe might be a very quick and fast Russian takeover of the country. On our next slide, we see some of the data about the Russian attacks that there have been on the Ukraine, a distributed denial of service attack on Ukraine's government and banks ahead of the invasion. That meant that 70 Ukrainian websites were temporarily down. It's the largest cyber attack on Ukraine in 4 years. In other words, there have been other cyber attacks. In the last 9 months, the Ukraine Security Service said it neutralized some 1,200 cyber attacks. And an example of how these kinds of attacks can overflow, in 2017, the NotPetya attack on Ukraine, aimed at Ukraine, was designed to wipe out data, but it overflowed and hit computers which had the vulnerability that the NotPetya attack was focused on, and it caused some $10 billion worth of damage worldwide. In other words, the issue for all organizations is that cyber risk is not just in the Ukraine and is not just Ukraine organizations. We've seen the Chief Information Security Officers warned to consider not just state-sponsored attacks, but to reflect on the reality that attacks are focused on vulnerabilities in software rather than specifically on organizations. And if an attack which is designed to bring down, let us say, a Ukraine government website is focused on a particular vulnerability that is thought to be in the software operating that site, and that vulnerability exists elsewhere on the website, all of those other websites are likely to be impacted as well. So CISOs have been encouraged by the cybersecurity organizations in the US, in Britain, and around the world to focus on dealing with the challenges that come about as a result of exactly this kind of issue. Make sure that appropriate configurations of software are in place, recognize that shortages of appropriately trained cybersecurity staff makes it a lot easier for attackers to find vulnerabilities and to exploit them, much harder for organizations to close those vulnerabilities down. That can lead to significant supply chain disruption. So attacks focused on critical national infrastructure like oil and gas can impact not just organizations, not just people who need oil and gas for heating and food and so on, but can also impact organizations that depend on the availability of oil, gas, water to produce the goods that they provide into their supply chain. Transportation is disrupted, insurance costs inevitably go up, and of course the reality that as the West imposes more and more sanctions on Russia, it's more and more likely that Russia will fight back more broadly, because it's very easy for Russia to identify, and you will have seen in the news that Russia is doing exactly that, is saying that the sanctions being placed on Russia are illegal, unjustified, and unacceptable, and that could very well provoke out of Russia a series of attacks much more broadly focused than simply on Ukraine. So you've got two issues. One is the spillover from attacks focused on organizations into the Ukraine, and you've got the likelihood of attacks being focused on organizations beyond the Ukraine as retaliation for sanctions for the supply of arms equipment to Ukraine, to the extent to which NATO and the European Union has solidified its positioning in response to the invasion of Ukraine. So on our next slide, how does this impact procurement and supply? The reality is, if you look at impact on organizations like Maersk, Merck, and FedEx in 2017 as a result of the attack on Ukrainian tax reporting by Russia, those organizations had similar vulnerabilities. The rollover attack cost them some $7.3 billion as a result, disrupted ports, shut down of manufacturing plants, government agencies hindered. All of those impact the logistics businesses of people like FedEx, Maersk, Merck, and so on. And that's a big spillover impact of an attack on a Ukraine software. The NotPetya attack, as I said, the malware leapt from tax filing software to computers across the Ukraine and then spread to businesses across the US and the EU, disrupted the health service in the UK significantly, created major supply chain disruptions, about $10 billion worth of damage worldwide, with some 2,000 systems affected, and those systems affected included some of the largest corporations in the West, not just small and medium organizations, but very significant businesses as well. So more than 5,000 firms in the US and Europe have Russian or Ukrainian suppliers in at least their tier 3. They might have not many in tier 1 and tier 2, but software and IT services account for 12% of supplier relationships between the US and Russian stroke Ukrainian companies. Trading and distribution is about 9% of all tier 3 relationships. Oil and gas account for about 6% of relationships. Small percentages when you look at the breadth of the supply chain, but every single organization that's taken up and impacted by a cyber attack has disruptive effects on the whole of its supply chain, particularly where that organization is a single point of failure or one of just 2 or 3 points of failure in the supply chain. And most organizations are not clear about where those single points of failure might be. Chief executive of Building Cybersecurity said Russia has hidden extremely powerful wiper viruses that are designed to delete entire networks in the form of much more routine-looking malware intrusions and ransomware attempts. In other words, don't think in today's environment that it's simply a ransomware attack because you get a sign on a computer saying, give us 35 Bitcoin and we'll give you your system back. Hidden inside that may well be wiper software whose intention is simply malicious. It's designed to wipe data off of the system, to take the system down. The US Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency said organizations should, particularly if working with suppliers or customers in the Ukraine, take extra care to monitor, inspect, and isolate traffic from those organizations, closely reviewing access controls for any traffic to or from those organizations. And I'm noticing questions come in, ladies and gentlemen. If you do have questions, do please use the chat function. We'll pick up those questions and I'll share the questions with you, and then where I can give you answers, I'll do that. In the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority has told banks to strengthen and test their defences against retaliatory attacks coming from Russia as sanctions begin to bite. And again, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre has just recently updated its guidance to say to organisations, bolster cybersecurity resilience in response to malicious cyber incidents in and around the Ukraine. And the fact that there have not been significant cyber attacks on the Ukraine in the last few days doesn't mean anything. The reality is that Russia works to its own timetable. And so when we look at the impact that Russia's cyber attacks on Ukraine could have on organizations worldwide, and you take into account that over the last 2 years, so many organizations have shifted to remote or hybrid working, which of itself makes organizations much more vulnerable to cyber attacks. Home networks and remote devices are often less secure than those safely behind a corporate firewall on the corporate premises, which makes individuals enticing targets. Threats have been issued by Russian both state actors and Russian cyber criminals, saying that cyber attacks might look like random technical glitches on personal computers, much more likely in the home environment to have somebody clicking on a link which they shouldn't do, but these could well be precursors or actual parts of the major cyber attack. Lack of cybersecurity awareness amongst employees and remote workers, shortage of cybersecurity skills. There's a shortage of about 100,000 competent cybersecurity personnel worldwide. All of those mean that organizations might be unable to spot a cyber attack, let alone recover from one if it occurs. So ongoing vigilance, preparation on the coalface, if you like, on the front line is much more critical than it ever was. So Russian-sponsored attacks on NATO allies' infrastructure, that's almost certain to raise itself over the course of the next weeks. It won't necessarily make it into the news, but data wiping malware attacks is, we see, a key part of the current range of cyber activity, unquestionably cyber espionage, distributed denial of service attacks where a Russian state-backed entity is able to control a bot network of 20 or 30,000 computers, which can take down a target website or email system, as appears, for instance, to have happened to the Ukraine embassy in London. There will be botnet attacks on newspapers and websites, alongside closing down independent media inside Russia. The reality is that many people inside Russia are able to get news through social media, which tells them things that the Russian government might not want them to know. That's almost certainly going to lead to increases in attacks on Western social media targets, because that will reduce the likelihood of information getting through to Russia, that information that might undermine the official line which is being pushed by the Russian government. So shutting down of websites, digital manipulation, application compromise, the whole range of issues which we've seen, which you saw touched on in the headlines in that first slide. Unquestionably, we will see more and more of that over the course of the weeks ahead as the Ukraine situation develops. And even if one was to assume that it might be finished and done with almost immediately, which it won't, the reality is that there's going to be a significant standoff between NATO and Russia over the course of a number of months to come. So what do? You're an organization, you've been getting on with dealing with business normally. Cybersecurity is an issue, you're aware of it, but actually right now what is happening in Ukraine brings cybersecurity right onto the boardroom table. You need to start building defense in depth. The reality of cyber attacks today is that they will penetrate. Cyber attacks are designed to get through multiple layers of defense. So you have to think about building defense in depth, cybersecurity defense in depth. And the front line The first line of defense is a combination of vulnerability scanning. In other words, deploying scans across your internet-facing services, applications, networks to identify any known vulnerabilities in them. A scanning service that does that will identify vulnerabilities, give you the formal identification of what they are. They're all formally identified, which means that you can take action very quickly to apply patches and bring the software to a point of defense. Alongside that, staff need to be trained and really aware of phishing attacks. They need to know what to look out for in terms of incoming phishing emails, and they need to understand the sophistication of these attacks, whether they're generalized phishing email attacks or focused email attacks, particularly those aimed at key individuals, what we call whaling attacks. You should also be thinking about multi-factor authentication. You should be thinking about strong password policies, but those take a bit longer to put in place than deploying a phishing staff awareness program and deploying vulnerability scanning. You can take those actions today and you can begin benefiting from them tonight and tomorrow. So that's a largely detective line of defense. Your second line of defense should be where you're starting to prevent the impact of these kinds of attacks. So penetration testing, a more advanced form of vulnerability scanning, which has a experienced security tester, not just looking for vulnerabilities, but seeing how those vulnerabilities can be exploited, identifying exactly what steps you need to take to repair them, giving you guidance on how to repair tests. You need to have a cybersecurity incident response stroke data breach reporting capability in place. And again, that's as simple as ensuring that people who receive a phishing email or click on a link they shouldn't click on know exactly who to escalate the issue to, know how you can deploy incident response, have on hand an outside supplier who can help you with rapid response to dealing with an incident, to identify if you have to report it to a data protection supervisory authority, and help you do that. And you can then move on to defensive mechanisms like cyber essentials. Those take slightly longer to put in place, have properly trained, security trained IT support staff, and build up your broader cybersecurity general data protection regulation staff awareness training. Third line of defense is a more extreme and developed form of preventive controls, embedded, risk-based, using standards like ISO 27001, which enables you not just to satisfy yourself that you've got appropriate controls in place, but also to demonstrate to your customers, suppliers, and stakeholders that you've taken appropriate steps to build a solid defense in-depth framework. Your fourth line of defense becomes corrective. It's about making sure that where breaches have happened in your supply chain, you're able to help your suppliers fix it. You're able to make sure that those don't come through to impact your organization. It's about business continuity management, IT disaster recovery. Those take much longer to put in place to build the capability to ensure that you can respond effectively. And of course, your fifth line of defense is when all else fails is cybersecurity insurance. Sadly, many organizations think that because they've got cybersecurity insurance, they don't need to do anything else. And the reality is exactly the opposite. Cybersecurity insurance does not stop you being attacked, does not stop you losing your website or going offline or suffering a data breach. It just simply helps you pay for the cost of recovery. So you should think of cybersecurity insurance, which for those of you who have it, you will have seen the cost going up dramatically this year over last year. You should think of it as the final line of defense, not the front line of defense. There's no silver bullet that protects you from a cyber attack. It's defense in depth that enables you to maximize your capability to respond to today's sophisticated and multifaceted cyber attacks. Of course, IT governance is there to help. Vulnerability scanning, you can read about it on our website, but you could sign up for vulnerability scanning today. You could deploy it across your internet-facing resources today. You could identify this afternoon where your vulnerabilities are and get started on patching those. You could deploy a phishing staff awareness program, which is updated on a quarterly basis. So it's really focused on helping people identify what current phishing attacks look like. You can roll that out. It's accompanied by an ongoing series of briefing emails on a monthly basis that keep people aware of and alert to phishing emails. So 2 steps you could take today to help strengthen your front line of defense. And once you've done those, or if you've already done them, you should be thinking about cybersecurity incident response. The faster you get a proper cybersecurity incident response process in place, the more stable your capability will be dealing with attacks. Incident response and data breach reporting go hand in hand. Cybersecurity as a service is an offering which we've developed as a, if you like, all-in-one defense in-depth option, which includes a cybersecurity insurance elements to it that's built into the price, but which provides the backup if all other elements in the package fail. So areas you should be going onto our website this afternoon, evening to have a look at and see how these types of services can help you deal with today's cybersecurity challenges. Here for the UK, the EU and the US are all of the websites and email addresses that enable you to find out more about how we can help you deal with today's cybersecurity threats. So questions, I'm going to ask Mahela to share the questions with me in a moment, but if you have questions, please do feed them in using the chat function. And then Mahela will share them with me. I'll read the question out to you and I'll give you an answer. So the first question, I think, was what is a whaling attack? A whaling attack is a bit like a phishing attack, but the logic is that it's aimed at catching a whale. A whale is the chief executive or the CISO or the finance director. And so the attack is very focused on the individual, and it's designed to enable an attacker to get into that individual's system so that they can access usually much more privileged and valuable information than they could by accessing simply that of any one given user. So that's what a whaling attack is. Is there an issue with using Kaspersky as a software firewall provider? I wouldn't want to cast doubt on Kaspersky, but Kaspersky is a Russian organization, and right now it's clear that in the mind of the Russian dictatorship, you're either loyal to the dictatorship or you're not. I don't know what that means for Kaspersky. That's a risk question that every organization that uses Kaspersky today has to answer. As I said, I don't have a personal view, but then we've never seen before a situation in which Russia is engaged in a cyber war with the West, which could call into question something like Kaspersky. So the next question. We will email everyone the slides and recording, as Mahela has said, for those of you who've seen it. Any other questions? Mahela, have we got other questions that I'm not yet seeing?
I think there's a question on Cyber Essentials certification, if it helps as a first line of defense.
Okay, I'm not seeing the question. So if you just read me the question and then I'll answer it. Does Cyber Essentials certification help as a first line of defense? Sorry, I just saw that one. So the answer is it helps as a first line of defense, but if you don't already have it in place, it's likely to take you several days or weeks to get there. So we talk that therefore as a second line of defense. It's a series of 5 technical controls that unquestionably help you deal with the likelihood of attack. But your starting point, if you don't have a first line of defense, should be to make sure that you're scanning for vulnerabilities and your staff are aware of phishing attacks. Cyber Essentials does not include staff awareness around phishing attacks. So from that point of view, it's really only a good second line of defense. You've got to make sure that you don't have vulnerabilities in your websites, and you've got to make sure that the fuzzy firewall, which is your staff who are receiving and processing emails, are able to recognize attacks and deal with them. It is clear that Russia has been preparing for this for a very long time. Is there an indication of how far back something might have been embedded into our systems? The answer is no, there isn't. It depends entirely on your own systems. You will have seen that there have been state actor involvement in the infection of software which has been deployed through IT service organizations, the SolarWinds breach and others. So it's entirely possible that organizations might have malware installed inside their backups, which has been there for a number of months. So you need to be very careful in terms of deploying backups to make sure that you are clear that the backup itself is clean and is working. Any risk posed by Russian customers? The answer is, again, it depends. Any email which is coming in from Russia has the possibility of being compromised. While it is clear that not everybody in Russia supports the attack on the Ukraine, it's very difficult for you to be clear as to which customer or supplier in Russia is or isn't supportive of the attack, or more importantly, whose email or whose internet resources has or has not been taken over by a Russian cyber actor. We mentioned, understandably, attacks on Ukraine and spillover. What about cyber attacks on NATO member states? I think I talked about those. There will be unquestionably more attacks on cyber member states, recognizing that it's NATO member states that are attempting to provide the NATO version, the West version of what's going on in Ukraine through social media and through email and so on to people inside Russia. It's NATO which is supplying arms and armaments to Ukraine, and it's members of NATO who are quite clearly upping their investment in kinetic, traditional defense hardware and capability, and Russia unquestionably will take that on. Russia unquestionably will see that as a significant threat. It's entirely possible that Russia might not have imagined that there would have been the concerted and unified response, particularly at the speed there has been from NATO and the West, and that might provoke in Russia an escalation in what they were planning to do. Do you have any recommendation if you have branches in Russia connected to our WAN? I would apply exactly the guidance which you can see from the US CISA, from the UK's Cybersecurity National Security Center, which is to examine very carefully the link from Russia into your WAN, if possible, to put it through a firewall filter that enables you to monitor and control traffic coming in. You have to assume that anything that's happening inside the growing iron cyber curtain may be compromised. It might not be. Your own team inside Russia could be completely normal, acting as normal. I know of many teams that are, but you just have to put in place a mechanism for ensuring that the traffic coming into your own organization is secure and is clean. Do I think companies like Microsoft are at risk? No, not necessarily. Microsoft's own security is very well established. They're a very solid organization. But if you have Microsoft software which is out of support, or you haven't applied the latest patches, you will be at risk, because there is so much Microsoft software, just like there is Apple software deployed around the world. Unquestionably, Russian state and cyber actors will be attacking vulnerabilities in Microsoft software. So if you use any Microsoft systems, one of your top priorities should be to make sure you're completely patched, up to date, and you're paying attention to any new patches that come out. There's no way you can tell what type of attack is included in a phishing email. A phishing email is designed to look like something simple and innocuous. It could be as simple as here's a job you should be looking at that comes from what looks like a LinkedIn profile or LinkedIn recruiter. It could be a link to a report from what looks like a supplier. It could be news about your own business in Russia that looks as coming from somebody in Russia. It's designed to be innocuous, to be something where you'll click on it. It's designed to exploit human weaknesses. Phishing attackers are very sophisticated. They've been doing this for a long time. They understand human psychology. So you don't know what type of attack it is. The critical thing that you have to teach staff, and this is why phishing staff awareness repeated with tests tied into it is so important. It's about having staff learn to say, this is not an email that I'm expecting. Because I'm not expecting it, I'm not going to click on the link. I wasn't expecting this payment to arrive from this customer. I'm not even sure that this PO is a customer of ours, so I'm not clicking on the link. You need to have a process in place that enables you to test that to make sure it's genuine. And of course, 95 times out of 100, it will be genuine. But as I've said so many times, your attacker has to be successful only once to penetrate your defenses. You have to be successful 100% of the time to defend yourself. What about Google Drives, Dropbox? Absolutely at risk. Dropbox is an area where other people can upload data, upload documents, unless you're absolutely certain that the document that is then being downloaded into your network is clean. You could very well be downloading malware. So Google Drives, data sent to you, any form of data which you haven't been able to inspect or you haven't been able to confirm is genuinely secure, clean data is possibly at risk. As I said, 95% of the time it won't be. It's the 5% of the time where it is a phishing attack. It could be random, it could be aimed at you, but it's that's the problem. And the issue for all organizations is the way in which the impact of a cyber attack spreads. If one organization in your supply chain is compromised and it is then able to compromise another 5 organizations, suddenly there are 6 organizations who will be trying to compromise you. And that's pretty well the approach you have to take. You have to be, in circumstances like we face today, you have to be paranoid. Paranoid is the one logical approach to dealing with the range of issues that you've got to deal with from a cybersecurity perspective. And as I said, in most cases, your paranoia will turn out to have been unnecessary because the incoming communication will be clean. It's in the small number of cases where it's not that you could save your organization from hundreds of thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of pounds worth of damage, of destroyed reputation. And remember, lots of organizations are going to be affected. So many of the West's own capabilities for responding are likely to be running at capacity over the course of the next week. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's it in terms of questions. We're certainly there in terms of the half an hour that we scheduled this session for. So I hope everybody's found that useful. Please, if we can help you protect yourself, they are well-priced, high-value options. They're available on our websites. Please do take advantage of those. And above all, please do stay secure. Good luck. Bye-bye.